rod builders, Bill Falconer here with Falconer Custom Rods and Anglers Resource, your North American supplier of Fuji products, and here today to do a video about some different guide finishing techniques. This is the way I've been putting finish on guides of all types for a long time. It's a little bit different. It's kind of a combination of techniques I learned from different people, and so I thought we would interactively run you through it today. And so hopefully by the end of this video, you'll know all the steps you need to take with your threads on your guide wraps before you apply your first coat of finish, how to apply the first coat, and then how to apply the second coat such that that's all you need to get perfect edges and good even depth and coverage. So there's a few things we're going to need in order to do this. So obviously we have a rod blank wrapped with guides and ready to go. Whatever kind of rod stand or wrapper you're going to use. You'll also need a finish drying motor. Use whatever RPM you like. We have some rubbing alcohol and some small squares of paper towel that we've cut so we can use to clean our tools. We have some mixing cups, some Gen 4 regular high build epoxy, and then I've also got a thread packing and burnishing tool, and the spatula I use to apply finish and do the edging around wraps, just a garden variety Bic lighter, a single edge razor blade, and some masking tape. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So what we've got here is a section of rod blank, and it's got 3 guides wrapped on it, right? So this is just like if we had wrapped the entire rod, and I'm gonna now go through the process of straightening these guides, and in the spirit of measure twice and cut once, I've already straightened these, but they look exactly right. And now, you need to be aware that sometimes when you straighten your guides, and I think we all have to straighten them a little bit, you may disrupt the thread, right? And so on these wraps in particular, I have, like I always like to do with single foot guides, I have not only the wrap over the guide foot, I also have some blocking wraps, kind of locking wraps behind these single foot guides to help keep them in place and keep them from pulling out, going in and out of a rod locker, or if they accidentally snag on something or get abused. So you just want to be mindful that when you move your guides around, you might create gaps in your thread or places that you need to clean up. So that now that I've got them arranged finally, I'm going to go back to each guide wrap and I'm going to do a couple of things. One is I'm going to rotate the rod and make sure these edges are completely square. And the reality is sometimes they're not, and that's okay. So I'm just going to take my packing tool here, and if they're at all out of square, I'm going to justify them and clean them up. I'm going to pay particular attention to where the blocking wraps meet the regular wraps. And on this larger guide, I also like to burnish a little bit gently the thread that's kind of creates the tunnel beside each guide. And now what you should get is they should look very even, very smooth, very gap free. That one's perfect. Now I'm going to go to this one. And obviously the reason why we're spending so much time getting the square edges of the edges of our wraps square is you can't expect to have even overlap of finish off of the thread wraps onto the guide blank if the thread wraps themselves aren't straight. I think what our eye normally sees is that interval of overlap, but we always want to try to get it as perfect as we can. So now I've got this guide well burnished, and I know this probably seems like a lot of effort, but you want to inspect these guides really closely right now, because once we put on the first coat of finish, we can't change anything. So now is the time to correct any issues, close any gaps, make sure everything looks good. And we're just going to check this last one here, and this is a little bit out of round, so I'm going to square it up. You generally want to square it up by packing in towards the wrap and getting it tighter, not by burnishing it apart. So I'm going to do this every time with every rod on every guide wrap. One final inspection before we go to apply finish. So now that I've done that, we're going to measure and mix our finish prior to the application of the first coat. So what I've got here is just a regular, I think it's a 1 ounce mixing cup. These are graduated. They can be or not, however you like. Again, it doesn't matter so much exactly how you do this as long as you do it exactly the same way every time and that you're getting a really good result. So for me, I get a really good result when I measure my finish, and this is Gen 4 regular high build, but I do the same thing whether I'm using Flex Coat Ultra V or Flex Coat High Build. I'm going to use the bottle that the finish came in, these syringe bottle caps, and syringes. These are the CRB syringes, and we can go back and add part numbers to all this stuff after, or up in the corner of the screen so you know which parts we're using. But this helps me get a really consistent finish, and I can't remember the last time I had a batch of finish not set up. I should also say that part of this is temperature control as well. So we're working in about 72 degrees with a very steady temperature in a relatively clean, dust-free environment. And as much as you can create those conditions, that's going to help you, right? So one little trick, when builders have trouble with finishes not setting up, I think there's a temptation to use a little extra hardener, or in this case, catalyst, rather than resin. And so if the manufacturer recommends a 1-to-1 mix, you need to get an exact 1-to-1 mix. However, if you miss or if you err, you want to have more resin, not more hardener. These epoxies, these 2-part amine resin systems, almost always have a broader room for error towards too much resin than they do too much hardener. So sometimes it would be natural to think, oh, I want to be really sure my batch of finish sets up, so you add some extra hardener, and in reality, that makes you resin starve the mixture, and that's what makes it tacky and makes it not set up. So what you should be going for is an exact 1-to-1. But if you miss, you would like to miss with slightly more resin than hardener. I realize that's counterintuitive, but that's the truth. And so to that end, everybody has a different way of doing this, but I mix it and measure it exactly the same way every time. And so I'm always going to start with part B, my catalyst, my hardener, that part which is not my resin. The other thing, just full disclosure, that I'm going to do today, if you read the manufacturer's recommendations, Gen 4 recommends a minimum of 3 cc's of each part. That is also the Flex Coat recommendation. That is a good recommendation, and you should follow that. However, I get frustrated sometimes, and I know the folks in the finish business get frustrated sometimes when builders believe they've gotten a bad batch of finish and it won't set up. If it doesn't set up, it is operator error, I promise, right? So we don't need to go on a witch hunt with our finish. We need to work on our techniques and make sure that we're not creating the conditions by which this stuff doesn't set up. So for me, one of the things that's really, really helpful is to always do it exactly the same way every single time. So I am always gonna measure the part B, the hardener or the catalyst first. And to be controversial today, I'm gonna mix 1.5 cc's of each. Now hopefully Roger and John at Flex Coat and Andy at Gen 4 aren't rolling their eyes right now, but the point I'm just trying to prove is that this finish, when you measure it and mix it 1-to-1, it will set up, it has to. So I mix batches of 1.5 cc's of each part all the time. But a couple of things, this hardener or catalyst is the thinner of the two. I'm going to draw the syringe most of the way down, and you can see, you may be able to see there's a bubble in the syringe. That's fine, it's always going to be there. But by drawing past where I want to go, I then sort of have a chance to get rid of that bubble and bring the plunger up to the line where I want to be. If you're a guitar player and you play guitar, you always go sharp, flat of the note and then tune up to it rather than tuning down where the string can slip. Same thing. I don't want to be pulling down. When I come to my final measurement, I always want it to be where I'm pushing back up into the bottle. But I want you to see that that plunger is right on that line. Not close to it, not a little bit above it, not below it. It is right on the line so that the plunger is touching the bottom edge of the 1.5 mark. And that's what I want. And I'm literally going to do it to that space, that spot exactly every single time. Now here's the other trick. I'm just going to squirt this into the bottom of my mixing cup. And then I'm going to pull the plunger back, I don't know, a couple of cc's, and I'm going to wait. And I'm going to actually squeeze out that little bit of finish that's in the tube of the plunger. And we'll get a close-up of this in a minute, and you can see. But as soon as it will no longer, when I wait and don't push the plunger, when it ceases to kind of refill and push out, and what it pushes out will often look like a bubble, you can just touch it to the top of the finish or you can touch it to the side of the cup. But once I've gotten all those bubbles out, then I've gotten all 1.5 cc's of the hardener or catalyst out of the syringe and into the cup. You'll notice that I keep the syringe pulled down a little bit. I like to keep them pulled down at 1 cc. If you leave them closed all the way, depending on how often you're finishing, sometimes it can be hard to get them unstuck. And with some of the syringes that have a rubber stopper on the end, it can separate from the tube. If you leave it pulled back to 1 cc, that will never happen. Of course, we don't have to worry about that with these CRB syringes either. So I'm emptying all the air from the syringe into the bottle, turning it upside down, and now I'm gonna wait. This is the resin. It is thicker, as it is in most epoxies or rod finishes. It's thicker than the catalyst or the hardener. So I'm gonna let those bubbles get out of the way, because if I turn it over and pull the plunger really fast, I'm gonna get a bunch of bubbles in the syringe, and that can affect my measurement, especially in these smaller quantities. So now once again, I'm gonna pull, and I'm pulling very slowly. You're generally gonna get a bubble with the resin every time, regardless of what product you use, but you can make it a pretty small bubble and you can leave it up to towards the top of the syringe. So I've pulled that all the way down to 3 cc's, and now as I go to squeeze it, and I'm just kind of turning it to manipulate where that bubble goes, same thing, I'm pushing up until I get to the edge of the plunger right at the bottom of the 1.5 cc mark. It's in exactly the same place it was in with the blue syringe in the catalyst bottle. That's the exact same spot I've gone to with the resin here in the red syringe. Now same thing, I'm gonna squirt it into the cup now. I don't know if this makes any difference. I like to kind of squirt it all around like icing on cinnamon rolls. Kind of get it pre-mixed a little bit. And again, I'm going pretty slowly. If I push this thing quickly as hard as I can, you can often get a lot of bubbles in there, and there's lots of ways to remove bubbles, and we can talk about those, but the easier way to fix a problem is just to never create it, right? So again, I pulled the plunger, I've emptied it into the mixing cup, and I pulled the plunger back to 3 cc's, and I'm just kind of waiting, and now that tube is kind of filling, and I'm just squeezing out that last little bit, and it kind of almost comes out like a bubble. It usually takes a little bit longer with this, with the resin than it does with the catalyst or hardener, just by virtue of the higher viscosity. All right, and once it's no longer yielding any more finish out of the syringe, I put it exactly at 1 cc, just as I did with the catalyst syringe, and put it back in the bottle. Okay, so now it's time to mix, but before I do that, I'm gonna do one more step. So in this example, our finish, or our rod, has only been sitting here a few minutes, but I do this every time. It's good hygiene, it'll keep you out of trouble. In addition to kind of burnishing and justifying these wraps and making sure there's no gaps, I'm just gonna take a piece of masking tape and I'm gonna fold it over sticky side out. And I'm just creating a little bit like a tack cloth, or what finish carpenters use. And I'm just kind of tacking it to that guide wrap. And if there's any, loose debris, skin flakes, dander, whatever, hair, fur, lint, fuzzies, whatever you want to call it, I don't know if there's anything on that guide wrap that's foreign that can be picked up, I've just picked it up without contaminating the wraps at all. So now I know that they're clean and good to go. So now we're gonna mix the finish, and I mix the finish exactly the same way every single time. You'll notice a theme here. And I'm literally gonna start the chronograph on my watch, and I do this with every single batch of finish that I make. I either use the watch, or if I'm wearing a watch that doesn't have a chronograph, I'm using my iPhone. But I'm gonna do this by time. Since we measured 1.5 cc's of each, 3 minutes is totally adequate time to mix. And so I'm gonna start my chronograph, and then we're gonna mix the finish. But before I do that, just to walk you through what I'm gonna do, and again, this might come across a little OCD, a little detail oriented. I'm gonna start with a clean spatula, by sticking it in the finish and waiting a second so that the finish has a chance to crawl up the sides of it, so I'm not introducing a lot of bubbles. Then I'm gonna start to slowly stir. I'm going to stir for between 1:20 and 1:30 seconds, or to when this Gen 4 is no longer hazy and the spatula is no longer leaving streaks as it goes through the finish. Then I'm going to scrape the sides of the cup for a while. I'll go around probably a half dozen times, and then I will go back to finish to slowly mixing, and then I will scrape the finish off the spatula and let it run down the side of the cup and go back to regular mixing. And then I will do one final scrape around the cup, mix that all in, and then we're done. And it's gonna take me about 3 minutes to 3 minutes and 10 seconds. So I'm gonna start now. I like to put the cup in my hand so it kind of keeps it warm. And I put the spatula in and I don't start mixing immediately. I give it a minute before I start mixing around, so that way it doesn't create a bubble trail and doesn't introduce bubbles. And again, I'm not being terribly gentle with it, but I'm also not mixing it like a lunatic and trying to create, too many bubbles. Right now the finish looks really streaky, swirly. It's kind of got opaque streaks and swirls that follow behind the spatula, and that's okay. That just lets me know where I am. If I start to get a lot of bubbles in the finish, then I'll slow down. If I'm not getting any bubbles at all, I can speed up a little bit. But I'm not sort of whipping it into a frenzy, right? Every once in a while you can rotate the cup a little bit. Probably halfway into this first period, it's starting to clear up for me pretty well. Stirring all around, and again, I'm keeping the nose of the spatula in contact with the bottom of the mixing cup the whole time. So now we're pretty close. I'm gonna check, okay, it's 1 minute and 15 seconds, so it went a little fast for me, but now I'm literally holding the spatula stationary and I'm rotating the cup. And this effectively scrapes the sides as well as the bottom corner. So now I put it back in the palm of my hand where I can kind of warm it with my warm hands, right? And I'm back to just regular mixing. Okay, we're at 2 minutes, and I'm going to scrape the sides again. And don't have to do this too many times, just gonna do it 5 or 6 times all the way around. Now I'm gonna scrape the excess off the spatula just in case any of that's unmixed. Put the spatula back in, and now I'm gonna be mixing again. That looks good to me. Okay, check the watch. We're at 3 minutes and 4 seconds, so about right. Now here's where the paper towels and the alcohol come in. The spatula is not a disposable tool. I guess it could be, but I'm gonna just use one small square of paper towel, almost the size of a gun cleaning patch for like a rim fire or something, and I'm gonna wipe it with a dry piece of paper towel, and then I'm gonna get a paper towel wet with some IPA, some isopropyl rubbing alcohol. You can use denatured alcohol too if you want, it's just not necessary and it costs more. And I'm gonna clean off that spatula and make sure I'm good to go. So now we are at not even 4 minutes yet, and since this is the first coat, we're gonna proceed directly to applying the finish to the rod. Okay, so this is kind of like you've probably seen it done. I think the only thing that I'm doing any differently is that I'm using a spatula instead of a brush to apply it. You could do this under power. I personally think you get a lot more control with the first coat and the second coat for guides doing it by hand. So I'm gonna do the whole thing with the spatula by hand. A couple of things before we start here. I have plenty of working time with this Gen 4. I can do an entire 11-foot spay rod in one coat before it gets so thick that I can't work with it, so don't worry about that. You want to start from the tip of the guide foot and work towards the guide ring. So since these are all single foot guides, I'm always gonna start on this side and work to this side toward the guide ring. If they were double foot guides, I would start on the outside of the wraps, again at the foot, and work towards the guide foot, just for reference. And the reason why we do that is that helps to force air out of the tunnel that's created between by the thread between the guide foot and the blank, right here where it sort of leaves the blank to cross over the guide foot. So if we start at the tip or the foot of the guide and work towards the ring, it naturally is going to push that air out. The other thing you should note is that I'm going to use a lot of finish. I'm going to use way too much finish. But again, the purpose of this first coat is complete even saturation, filling of those tunnels, and removal of all bubbles and any voids or air gaps. So we can always go back and remove finish here in a minute, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. So I'm just going to load up this spatula with a lot of finish, and it doesn't want to stay on there very well. I don't know if you noticed this, but some dripped off, but I've gotten in the habit, you see that, of putting the cup right under the guide wrap on my wrapper or on my bench, so that when it falls right into the cup and I don't make a big mess. Now, you see I've got a lot of finish, and on this first coat, there's lots of ways to do this. This is just what yields very good results for me. I'm not going off of the thread onto the blank. I'm only putting finish on the thread. Now I have enough finish on this wrap right now to probably cover the whole thing, but I'm going back to the well and I'm going to put more on. I don't want so much that it's suddenly climbing up the guide frame, especially on this beautiful Fuji KLSG titanium high frame K-concept guide. But I do want to make sure I absolutely saturate the wrap, and there's plenty to fill the void next to the guide foot or in that guide foot tunnel. But I am going just to the edge of the wrap, and I have a lot of control and precision with this spatula to put it exactly where I want, okay? And now I'm going to leave that wrap like that. And if we watch it for a second, if I'll leave it here without turning it, it's going to sag. You see that? There's enough finish on there that would drip off if I let it. I'm not going to let it. I'm going to keep turning it to prevent that from happening. And same thing, we're going to start at the foot of the guide, away from the guide ring, all the way on the edge of the wrap, and really get this loaded up. And you see with this Gen 4, Gen 4 has a lot of great properties, but one of the things it does exceedingly well is saturate threads and release bubbles. So this does not take long. If you're using a thicker or more viscous finish, it might take longer, and you might want to go a little bit more slowly with your application, but it's the same concept. You're putting plenty of finish on there to absolutely saturate the entirety of the guide, fill that tunnel next to the guide foot, and then we can remove the excess. Another thing that's worth noting here, I think, is we've used, and we can show you the spool of thread, but this is a Pro Wrap regular nylon thread in a kind of a hunter or camo drab green. It's just a really pretty color that I like. I use for a lot of different rods. You can see the difference in color between the regular untreated nylon thread and once we put the finish on it. And this is where our burnishing, especially with a light blank like this, becomes so important. If I put a very light colored thread on a dark blank, or a dark thread like this on a light colored kind of S-glass caramel, glass blank, any gaps in my thread, any places I failed to burnish or anything are gonna really show through cleanly. And again, that's why we did that final inspection before we started applying. And you can see I'm just kind of rotating by hand here. If we were going to try to do more than 3 guides, I'd be moving a little more quickly. But since we're just doing this as a demonstration, I don't have to be in a big hurry. Again, if I stopped turning this by hand, finish would drip off, and that's okay. But you just need to be mindful of that. So I'm going to get my cup under this last one. Obviously, as the guides get smaller and as you move up the rod and the diameter of the blank gets smaller and smaller, you need less and less finish, so kind of you can go accordingly. And remember, I said we want to put on a lot, but not so much that it runs down the foot or up the frame when the frame is facing down. Well, it takes a lot less finish to run up a size 5 frame than it does a 20 KLH, right? So adjust accordingly. I'm not putting on as much on the guides closer to the tip as I am the guides close to the butt. And hopefully that's intuitive to you and makes sense. That's for a host of reasons, but principally because the guide foot tunnel is largest on those large guides and it's smaller on these smaller guides. And so we need to use enough to get the job done without just completely overdoing it. Okay, so now I don't know if we want to go in for a close-up, but if you come look at if we look at this rod, all of our guides are completely saturated. We have good even coloration. The finish goes right up to the edge of the threads but does not cross over onto the blank. And that's exactly how I want it. So now, again, if I stop rotating, it's going to turn over, or it's going to drip on me. As I apply this first coat, I'm always going to start at the butt and work to the tip. And that's not just preference. I want the first guides, which are going to be the most challenging to get the tunnels saturated, because they're the largest tunnels beside the guide foot by virtue of having the largest guide feet. We start with our biggest size guides and applying and go to the tip. Then when I'm ready to start removing it, I'm actually going to work from the tip back to the butt. And you know, I could do something as simple as just stop rotating this, and a lot of this finish, you can see it sagging, is going to come off. I don't know, Phil, if you can get that. You see it's sagging, and it would easily, if I stopped rotating, you watch, it'll gather under. It would easily drip off. I'm going to play with fire here a little bit, and before it drips, I'm going to turn it, right? But you see my point. There's a lot of finish on it, but you notice it's not running up the frame of the guide. It's not making a huge mess. It's certainly not getting up into the guide ring or anything insane like that. So normally I would be taking a little more time getting all the guides and the tip top done out to the tip of the rod. And once I've gotten them all finished, then I'm going to do just a couple of simple things with each guide wrap. First, I'm going to apply some gentle heat. And I mean, this is not much. It's just a Bic lighter. I'm a ways from the guide, and I'm literally just going to apply enough heat so that it wants to sag. And remember, this is this blank is probably close to 3/8 of an inch, certainly 5/16 or larger. I would use less heat with an even smaller guide at the very small tip section of a blank. You can melt a blank. You can delaminate a blank. I'm not using that much heat. It's always moving. It never stops on the wrap, and it's never so close that the flame comes anywhere near touching it. I get people asking me all the time, they say, are you getting soot on your wraps? I'm getting soot on the wraps. Don't touch the flame to the wrap. It can't do that if you don't get that close. So now you can see it's kind of gone back to behaving like the finish on the other guides that was not warmed. But what I've done, when I warmed it, I thinned the viscosity of it a little bit, and it acts like thin. It acts like low build, and it lets. There were some air bubbles beside the guide foot, and they're all gone. I can see that they're all gone already with that one application of heat. But I'm just going to see the flame is constantly moving. It's a few inches below the rod blank. I'm going to get it good and warmed and flowing again, and then I'm going to stop with the guide facing up and be ready, because it's going to want to drip pretty quickly, and I'll either let it drip, or because I've got these other ones that I don't want to drip onto this countertop, I'm going to literally use the spatula to remove the excess finish. And that's good enough for now. We'll come back to that one in a second. Okay, now the second guide wrap, same thing. It's already running and it's already wanting to droop and sag, but keeping the blank rotating, I'm warming it until I see that finish begin to react, and you will see it start to sag a little more quickly. And that's all you need to do. Just enough heat to get it to behave differently, and you're where you want to be. Checking our guide foot, that one looks great. We got all the bubbles out. So I'm gonna warm it gently one more time, and I'll do this with every wrap. You have your cup under there just in case you need it, and I'm watching this one. This one's wanting to sag on me. That's okay. We'll come back and get more of that in a second. I'm gonna just remove a little with the spatula, and we'll do our final in a second. Okay, now final guide wrap. This is the largest wrap. Now this one I can see, I'm going to redistribute a little more finish towards the end of the wrap, kind of to assist that guide tunnel area before I warm it, because that's where I want it to run when it gets warm. And again, this warming it, heating element is probably not entirely necessary with Gen 4 because it relieves bubbles or releases bubbles so well, but it's a matter of habit. I get really good results when I do this. So I've warmed it now. I redistributed it a little bit so it's in the mouth of that guide tunnel. I can already see bubbles coming out that weren't coming out before. So I'm gonna put a little bit more towards the tunnel on this side, move some more of it towards the end of the wrap. And again, we've got oodles of time with this stuff. And I'm looking, and I can see that we've gotten all the bubbles out next to those guide feet. So I'm gonna let it, try to throw my finish off. Let it drip off into the cup. Now I'm gonna leave the rod, if I'm on my last guide, I'm gonna leave the rod pointing with the guides up. So if this was a spinning rod, this would be like the spinning reel facing up. And if it will sag and run, I'm gonna remove it. Because we've completely saturated, and I don't know, Phil, if you can see this and still dripping here. As much wants to come off, let it come off, because you've already filled the guide foot tunnels. You don't need any more than that. And this is why I say, personally, I don't think you need a low build, thin finish. You don't need light. You can use heat, and can you see how there's still some finish here? I'm just gonna use the spatula and lift it off. And I'm just literally kind of touching it to there and pulling back towards me in kind of a gentle swiping motion. I don't have to get too much off. And now if I'll turn around and let it hang guides down, it's gonna level out a little bit. There's a couple of places where I can see threads. I can actually see the texture of the threads. That's okay. We're gonna put another coat on, and 2 coats will be more than enough. The other thing you wanna inspect for now is if you're gonna get any surprises, it's gonna be bubbles coming out from beside the guide foot tunnels. And I can see through this translucent nylon thread and see that I don't have any bubbles, except for maybe one on one side. I'm not gonna fix it. I'm gonna leave it in there because hopefully it'll come out and create a bubble and I can show you how to fix it. But I'm just looking, and the wraps are not perfect. There's some fuzzies, and that's okay. We kind of did our tie-offs so there would be fuzzies, because we'll teach a lesson on that. And I'm also looking at how much is running out from under the guide foot in this kind of intersection. I don't want it to be too much. But basically, we have a complete saturating coat. We have very good even color. I can see that we've gotten the bubbles out from beside the guide feet, out of those tunnels. So we've got complete saturation, except for that one, which I'm gonna leave because I actually want it to come out. And we're good to go. So now all we're gonna do is take a drying motor. You can use anything from 6 RPM to 18 RPM. I think this one is 9 RPM. And I just put the, turn it on. And that's it. Now we're gonna leave it alone. In terms of when you can recoat, I like to give it 24 hours or close to that at about 74 degrees. If you're in a hurry, which I don't recommend because everything always goes wrong when you're in a hurry, you will learn new ways to mess things up when you're in a hurry. And I'm gonna clean my spatula while I'm talking so I don't forget. You could recoat Gen 4 at 74 degrees in probably as little as 8 hours. It's still gonna be soft, not exactly tacky, but just be mindful of that. And again, I recommend, for a host of reasons, giving it at least 12 hours, but try to recoat the second coat within 24 hours. And the reason for doing that is, and you may have seen this if you've ever done some repairs, if you let more than 24 hours go by with the first coat, when you put the second coat on, it acts just like a completely separate coat, like layers in an onion that can be peeled apart. When you put the second coat, when you recoat within 24 hours or less, it's generally gonna form one matrix. It's gonna cross-link, I believe is the technical term. Some chemical engineer can correct me, but you get cross-linking between those two coats if you recoat within 24 hours, and so you just get a more solid, kind of structurally sound matrix. I don't think it really matters. It's all way stronger than we need for fishing, but as long as we're gonna do it, let's do it right. All right, so that's the first coat. We're gonna let it cure 24 hours. We'll come back and do a second coat.